Here we are, AP Biology, Chapter 26. We're looking at the endocrine system or chemical regulation. This is part 2 video. In this video, we're going to focus on the endocrine glands that are specific to the brain. And so when we look at the endocrine system overall, it's actually made up of more than a dozen different glands. And what they have is they can be things that produce hormones specifically for the endocrine system, or they can be somehow involved in the endocrine system but not directly producing hormones. And so what we're going to look at is all the different glands. We're going to work our way through them. But a few things to keep in mind is that only the sex organs, so only the ovaries and the testes, are actually going to be producing the steroid hormones that we've previously talked about in the chemical communication in the part 1. The other thing that does steroid hormones or lipid hormones is the adrenal glands, which sit directly on top of the kidneys. And otherwise, most of the other glands that we're going to look at in the body of vertebrates are the water-soluble hormones. Again, let's look at a picture of all of the different endocrine glands. So there's the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. Those are specific to the brain. That's what we'll focus on in this video. Then there's the thyroid and parathyroid. There's the thymus. And then there's those adrenal glands. So these are the glands that produce our steroid hormones. There's the pancreas, which is this kind of globular, glandular thing that lays directly across the intestines and stomach. We'll see it when we do our fetal pig dissection. And then we have ovaries and testes. Again, these are the reproductive structures that also produce the steroid hormones. So if we're looking at the glands that are specific to the brain, what you'll see is that there's the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and then the pituitary gland. Now the pineal gland is the small little structure that is kind of behind your ears but inside of your brain. And what the pineal gland is going to do is it's kind of responsible for your daily kind of rhythms. So it's like your circadian rhythm. So you're awake during the day and you're asleep at night. That's actually controlled by the melatonin that comes from your pineal gland. This also is what helps animals know that their seasonal cycle. So for example, bears that hibernate or animals that do that pseudo-hibernation that we talked about in our thermoregulation, that is being controlled by the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland also doesn't just control your daily activities and rhythms, but it also can help cue reproductive activity in mammals. So when an animal falls into heat, that is due to the pineal gland secreting those hormones. Now, one of the glands that is not specific to the brain region is the thymus gland, but I want to talk about it right now. The thymus gland is what produces the T cells that are found in our immune system. And the thing that's interesting about a thymus is that it gets drastically smaller after an individual has hit puberty. And it's not because it doesn't produce T cells anymore, it's simply that it produces less of them because by then we've been exposed to many of our pathogens. Now, the hypothalamus, also a gland that is found in the brain, is actually tied very closely to the pituitary. And this is where we find that connection between the nervous and the endocrine systems. So what the hypothalamus does is it controls all of the other glands. And how does it do that? Well, the hypothalamus gets all of its information from the nervous system. So those sensory neurons are telling or relaying to the interneurons. The interneurons are then relieving that information to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then goes and gives the information out to all of the other endocrine glands, which then can cause a response in the body. Now, the hypothalamus is actually going to use the pituitary gland as a way of controlling all of those other endocrine glands. Now, the thing about the hypothalamus is that it actually produces hormones or causes things to produce hormones, but it also has a way of inhibiting the hormones. So here is a picture or diagram of the structures inside the brain. They're very small. So you can see we have the hypothalamus sitting directly on top of the pituitary glands. There is a posterior and anterior pituitary gland, and then again, they're kind of nestled within our cranium. Now, the posterior pituitary is actually just an extension of the hypothalamus, and its job is to store and secrete the hormones that have been made in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus makes hormones and then ships them off to the posterior pituitary, where they kind of hang out until they're needed. Two of the hormones that are made there are oxytocin and then the antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone is my personal favorite. It controls whether or not you pee, which is just kind of a fun fact. So the anterior pituitary, which is directly in front of the posterior pituitary, is actually in charge of making a lot of different hormones, and they all do a crazy amount of things. It is what controls the thyroid stimulating hormone, which controls your thyroid, the follicle stimulating hormone, which is involved in your ovaries, the luteinizing hormone, growth hormones, prolactins, endorphins. All of that is controlled by the anterior pituitary. And again, the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, which is in communication with the nervous system. So here we have a kind of diagram which I think helps do a lot of kind of understanding. So you can see here's the hypothalamus. It connects directly to the posterior pituitary because, again, what is the hypothalamus doing? Making the hormones. The hormones are then being stored in our posterior pituitary. What happens in our posterior pituitary is we're releasing those hormones to the circulatory system. And two such examples are oxytocin. So oxytocin is what controls kind of the uterus. So whether or not you're going to be experiencing contractions for labor pains. And then the other example is the antidiuretic hormone. And so it's going to go and target the kidney or the nephron tubule where we have the excretion, so the collection of water, which then ultimately becomes your urine. If we look at the diagram for the anterior pituitary, you can see it's much more complex. And why is that? Because the anterior pituitary is producing a lot of different hormones. The thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes and targets the thyroid, the adrenal cortex hormones, the follicle and luteinizing hormones, which are involved in our sex organs, the testes or ovaries, growth hormone, which actually targets your entire body. So that's your bones and your muscles and all of that. Prolactin, which is found in the mammary glands. That's how we produce a lot of our milk. And then the endorphins, which are found in our brain. So it kind of controls your pain levels, right? So all of those things are controlled by the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus is actually acting through the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary which hormones to release, and then the hormones then are released. One of the best examples is where we are communicating with the thyroid, with our thyroid stimulating hormone. So the hypothalamus is actually producing something called the thyroid reducing hormone. That hormone then stimulates the anterior pituitary to make thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone then goes to the thyroid and tells your thyroid, hey, you need to release and make the hormone thyroxine. The hormone thyroxine then travels around the body and causes an effect. The thing about this is that we're always trying to maintain homeostasis, and so we have the negative feedback control. So here's the example. So here's our hypothalamus producing a hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to release the thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone travels to the thyroid, which then causes the thyroid to make and release thyroxine. The thyroxine, on the other hand, while it goes and causes its own response, it's also going back and telling the hypothalamus, stop making TRH. It's telling the anterior pituitary, stop making thyroid stimulating hormone. So then we stop the production of thyroxine before we have too much of it. Other hormones that are coming from the pituitary is the growth hormone, and that's what does all of our protein synthesis, how much fat we're using. That's your kind of metabolism. Too much or too little growth hormone can cause a big problem. We have a really good article that we can read about it. And then prolactin, it kind of depends what species you're in, but again, I talked about how this is involved in reproduction. And then the endorphins, which is what happens when you get that runner's high from running, or when you have its own way of controlling pain. That's our final video for that part.